20 years gone, and my ex is back on my porch. My reaction. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. The man who destroyed my life 2 decades ago was shivering on my welcome mat, holding a cheap duffel bag. It was raining, a cold, piercing drizzle that made the suburban street look bleak, but inside my home, it was warm. The scent of Mark's famous garlic roast chicken wafted from the kitchen, a testament to the safe, beautiful life I had painstakingly built from the ashes. I was 45 now, grounded, secure, and deeply loved. The woman standing in the doorway was a world away from the shattered 25-year-old girl who had been left with nothing but a wedding dress and a pile of canceled vendor contracts. But as I stared at the hollowed-out face of the man on my porch, the past violently collided with the present. It was Julian. He looked aged, his once charming features sagging under the weight of some unseen burden. His expensive taste had apparently evaporated, replaced by a threadbare coat and shoes that had seen better days. "Clara," he croaked, his voice cracking perfectly, hitting that exact pitch of vulnerability he used to weaponize against me. I didn't know where else to go. My heart hammered against my ribs, a chaotic drumbeat of shock and suppressed fury. 20 years. 20 years of absolute silence. Not a letter, not a phone call, not a whisper through mutual friends. He had simply evaporated 3 weeks before our wedding, taking my savings and my sanity with him. It took me 5 years of intensive therapy just to trust another human being, and another 5 to let Mark into my heart. Now, Mark was standing in the hallway behind me, a dish towel thrown casually over his shoulder, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Honey? Who is it?" he called out, stepping closer. I couldn't speak. I could only stare at the ghost of my past, shivering on the welcome mat of my present. Julian's eyes flicked to Mark, then back to me, brimming with unshed, calculated tears. He was waiting for me to break, to invite him into the warmth, to be the savior I used to be. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the edge of the heavy oak door. I wanted to slam it in his face, to lock the deadbolt and return to my roast chicken and my perfect husband. I slowly realized he was hiding something inside his jacket. The sight of his hand twitching near his coat pocket threw me right back to the worst day of my life. 20 years ago, I had been standing in our tiny, overpriced apartment, staring at a closet that was completely empty on his side. I remember the deafening silence of that afternoon. My phone had been glued to my ear, calling his number over and over until it went straight to a disconnected tone. The panic had started as a tight knot in my chest and quickly spiraled into absolute hysteria. I had called the hospitals, the police, his estranged parents. Nothing. He had simply vanished, leaving behind a custom-made tuxedo, a non-refundable honeymoon suite in Maui, and a girl whose entire identity was wrapped up in loving him. The devastation wasn't just emotional, it was financial ruin. He had quietly drained our joint savings account the week before, leaving me to face furious caterers and an uncompromising landlord. I spent the next decade picking up the pieces, learning to sleep without waking up screaming, learning to breathe without the phantom weight of his betrayal crushing my lungs. And now, here he was, shattering the peace I had fought so desperately to achieve. "Clara, please," Julian whispered, pulling his hand out of his jacket to reveal nothing but trembling fingers. "I know I don't have the right to be here. I know what I did." Mark finally reached the door, his tall, broad frame instantly shifting into a protective stance. He took one look at Julian, then at my pale face, and the easygoing warmth vanished from his eyes. "Who are you?" Mark demanded, his voice dangerously low. Julian swallowed hard, shrinking back slightly, playing the intimidated victim to absolute perfection. "I'm an old friend," Julian lied smoothly, his eyes never leaving mine. "I've been in a terrible accident, Clara. I have no money, no family left, and nowhere to go." He leaned heavily against the doorframe, coughing violently into his sleeve. The coughing fit looked agonizingly real, a ragged, wet sound that tugged at the frayed edges of my empathy. Mark looked at me, waiting for my lead, his jaw clenched tight. He was waiting for me to make the absolute biggest mistake of my entire life. We shouldn't have let him inside, but the rain was turning into a torrential downpour, and Mark, despite his fierce protectiveness, is fundamentally a good, decent man. We guided Julian to the entryway bench. He looked pitiful, leaving a puddle of dirty rainwater on the tiles I had painstakingly chosen last spring. Mark handed him a towel, keeping a solid 2 feet of distance, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "I don't want to impose," Julian stammered, wrapping the towel around his shaking shoulders. "I suffered a severe traumatic brain injury about 10 years ago. It wiped out chunks of my memory, Clara. I woke up in a state facility 2 states over, not knowing who I was or how I got there." It was a masterful performance. His voice trembled at the exact right moments, his eyes welling up with tears that refused to fall. He painted a tragic picture of a man lost in the system, struggling with partial amnesia, living on the streets, and slowly piecing his life back together. He claimed he only recently remembered my address, remembering me as the only person who ever truly loved him. "I just need a couch for a few days," he pleaded, looking pathetically from me to Mark. "Just until my disability check clears and I can get a bus ticket to my sister's place in Ohio." I stood there, frozen, feeling the echoes of the girl who used to believe every word that came out of his mouth. But I wasn't 25 anymore. I was a 45-year-old woman who managed a regional logistics firm. I dealt with liars and opportunists for a living. Mark crossed his arms, his posture rigid. "We can pay for a motel down the highway," Mark offered coldly. "You don't need to stay here." Julian's face fell, a flash of genuine panic breaking through the sorrowful facade. "No, please," he blurted out, a little too quickly, his hands gripping the edge of the bench. "I can't go to a motel. The people looking for me might find me there." The air in the hallway instantly dropped 10 degrees at his desperate admission. Mark stepped squarely in front of me, shielding me completely from Julian's view. I suddenly noticed the very expensive, pristine watch hidden under his frayed sleeve. Against every rational instinct in my body, I told Mark we could let him sleep on the downstairs sofa for exactly 1 night. Julian was exhausted, or at least he played the part impeccably, collapsing onto the cushions. The surrealness of the situation hit me like a physical blow when I brought him a glass of water. He was sitting in my living room, drinking from the blue ceramic mug I had bought in Seattle. It felt like a violation of my sanctuary. He took a sip and offered a weak, nostalgic smile. "You still like blue? I see," he murmured softly. "Remember that little blue Chevy we used to drive to the coast? God, we were so young." I felt nothing but cold, hard detachment. There was no nostalgia, no lingering warmth, only a creeping sense of disgust. I ignored his comment and walked into the kitchen, pulling my phone from my pocket. I immediately called Sarah, my best friend of 30 years. She had held my hair while I threw up from panic attacks 2 decades ago. She knew the absolute devastation Julian had caused. "Tell me you are joking, Clara," Sarah hissed through the speaker, her voice vibrating with outrage. "Tell me you did not let that sociopath into your beautiful house with your amazing husband." "It's just for tonight," I whispered fiercely, watching Mark pace the length of the kitchen island. "He looks like he's dying, Sarah." "Mark is furious, but I couldn't just kick him into the storm." "Clara, listen to me," she warned, her tone turning deadly serious. "Julian doesn't do anything without a reason. He didn't come back for closure, and he certainly didn't come back to apologize. You need to get him out of there before he burns your life down a second time." I knew she was right. I hung up the phone and walked back toward the living room to check on our unwanted guest. I stopped dead in the hallway, pressing myself against the wall, holding my breath. He was actively digging through the decorative mail basket sitting on the console table. I stepped silently back into the kitchen, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. When I returned to the living room 2 minutes later, making sure my footsteps were heavy and loud, Julian was sprawled on the couch, his eyes closed, breathing evenly. The mail basket looked untouched, but my paranoia was now fully ignited. The next morning, the storm had cleared, but the tension in the house was suffocating. Mark was drinking his coffee in rigid silence, while Julian sat at my kitchen island, looking remarkably refreshed for a man who claimed to be suffering from chronic illness and extreme poverty. "This is a beautiful home, Clara," Julian said smoothly, buttering a piece of toast. "You've done really well for yourself. Did you keep your maiden name for the deed, or did you take Mark's?" The question was so casual, so seemingly innocent, but warning bells violently clanged in my head. Why would a homeless, amnesiac ex-fiancé care about the name on my property deed? "I took Mark's name," I lied smoothly, meeting his gaze without blinking. I hadn't. I kept my maiden name for all my professional and legal documents. A subtle, almost imperceptible flicker of annoyance crossed Julian's face before he masked it with a benign smile. Suddenly, his phone buzzed loudly on the marble counter. It wasn't the cheap, cracked screen you'd expect from a beggar. It was a brand-new, top-tier smartphone. He snatched it up with lightning speed, shoving it into his pocket and hiding the screen from view. "Just a spam call," he muttered, his earlier confidence wavering for a fraction of a second. "Julian," I said, leaning over the island. "You said you woke up in a facility in Ohio. But the mud on your boots is red clay. We don't have red clay around here, and neither does Ohio." His jaw tightened, and he realized he had made a massive geographical error. He stared at me in total silence as Mark slowly stood up from the breakfast table. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until Julian finally broke it with a nervous, breathless laugh. "You caught me," he deflected smoothly, holding up his hands in mock surrender. I was embarrassed. I actually spent the last week hitchhiking through Georgia, staying in awful shelters. I didn't want you to know how low I had sunk. It was a good save, but the seed of absolute distrust was firmly planted. After breakfast, Julian insisted on taking a long, hot shower to wash the road off. As soon as I heard the bathroom door lock and the water running, I nodded at Mark. While my husband stood guard in the hallway, I dropped to my knees beside the cheap duffel bag Julian had left by the sofa. My hands were shaking as I unzipped the main compartment. Inside, there were a few crumpled shirts and a pair of worn jeans, deliberately placed on top to look pathetic. But beneath the clothes, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, I found a sleek, expensive leather portfolio. My breath caught in my throat as I unzipped it. The first thing I pulled out was a pristine, high-limit credit card. It wasn't in Julian's name. It was in my maiden name, Clara Davis. My hands went numb as I stared at the embossed letters. Beneath the card was a stack of unopened mail, all addressed to me at my current address, but with a slight variation in the middle initial, just enough to bypass basic sorting flags if I wasn't looking closely. And underneath the letters was the most terrifying document of all, a legal summons from a debt collection agency in a state I had never lived in, demanding payment for a massive, defaulted business loan. The loan was co-signed by Clara Davis. I was staring at undeniable proof that my ex hadn't just abandoned me. He had stolen my entire identity. My mind raced as I desperately tried to shove the papers back into the hidden portfolio. The shower abruptly shut off, and the heavy bathroom door handle began to rattle loudly. I shoved the credit card and the legal summons back into the leather portfolio with trembling, frantic hands. I barely managed to zip the duffel bag closed and dive onto the opposite sofa before Julian stepped out of the bathroom, a cloud of steam trailing behind him. He looked at me, a polite smile plastered on his face, completely unaware that I had just discovered his monstrous betrayal. I excused myself, claiming I needed to log into work for an hour, and locked myself in my home office. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I initiated a deep-dive background check using resources from my logistics firm. I also quietly texted David, an old mutual friend who worked in corporate finance. The breadcrumb trail was horrifyingly clear. Julian hadn't been in a shelter or wandering with a brain injury. For the past 15 years, he had been living a lavish, high-rolling lifestyle in Atlanta, funding a string of failed tech startups using my pristine credit history as collateral. He had somehow acquired my social security number back when we were engaged and kept it dormant until he needed it. The background report showed luxury car leases, expensive downtown apartments, and a mountain of catastrophic debt that had finally collapsed onto his head 3 months ago. The timeline he had fed me was a complete fabrication. He had only hit rock bottom recently when his fraudulent house of cards imploded. David texted back quickly, "Julian? Stay away from him, Clara. Word is he's in deep trouble with some very dangerous private lenders." I stared at the glowing computer screen, the puzzle pieces clicking together with terrifying precision. He wasn't here to make amends. He was hiding from people who wanted their money, and he needed his favorite shield, me. He was going to use my home, my resources, and my remaining credit to save his own skin. A sudden, violent knock on my heavy office door made me jump out of my chair. "Clara, are you in there?" Julian's voice was muffled through the heavy wood, but the sugary sweet tone made my skin crawl with absolute revulsion. I quickly minimized all the browser windows, forced my face into a mask of polite indifference, and opened the door. He was standing there with a piece of mail in his hand, a letter from a local bank where I kept a small emergency fund. "The mailman just came," he said casually, holding the envelope out to me. I was just grabbing a glass of water and saw it on the porch. He was watching my eyes too closely, tracking my reaction. I took the letter, thanking him breezily, but my mind was spinning at warp speed. Why was he intercepting my mail? I went back to my desk and opened the envelope. It was a routine statement, but it contained a promotional flyer for a high-value home equity line of credit. Suddenly, the immediate, terrifying threat crystallized in my mind. He didn't just want to hide here. He had seen the equity mark and I had built in this suburban home. The credit card in my maiden name was just a tool. He needed me to unwittingly sign a document, or he planned to forge my signature to take out a massive loan against my property. He was going to drain my present just like he had drained my past. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. He wasn't a pathetic ghost seeking redemption. He was a highly calculated parasite preparing for a massive final feast. I looked out the window and saw Mark in the driveway, washing his car, completely unaware that the man sleeping in our living room was actively plotting to steal the roof over our heads. I knew right then that kicking him out wasn't enough. I had to destroy him. I picked up my cell phone with shaking hands and dialed my lawyer's private personal number. I waited until Julian announced he was going for a walk around the neighborhood to clear his aching head before I pulled Mark into the garage. The heavy scent of motor oil and damp concrete grounded me as I laid out the horrifying truth. I showed Mark the screenshots from the background check, David's warning text, and explained the fraudulent credit card hidden in the duffel bag upstairs. I watched my husband's face shift from cautious suspicion to a cold, terrifying rage. Mark is a gentle man, but seeing undeniable proof that a predator was sitting on our couch, plotting to steal our home, unlocked something primal in him. He immediately reached for the garage door button, ready to throw Julian's belongings onto the lawn and physically drag him off the property. "No, Mark, stop," I pleaded, grabbing his arm. "If we just kick him out, he disappears again. He still has my social security number. He still has that credit card. He'll just go to another state and keep destroying my financial life from the shadows." Mark paused, his chest heaving, the vein in his neck pulsing furiously. "So what do we do? Let him sleep in our house while he steals from us?" he demanded. "No," I replied, my voice remarkably steady. "We play his game. I spoke to my lawyer, Carter. We are going to let Julian think his plan is working. We need him to attempt the fraud while we have witnesses and authorities standing by. We need him to commit a federal felony on camera so we can lock him away for good." Mark stared at me, seeing the absolute, icy determination in my eyes. The devastated 25-year-old girl was gone forever. In her place was a woman ready for war. We agreed to endure the psychological torture of hosting my abuser for just a few more days to execute the trap. We walked back inside the house, completely ready to smile sweetly at the dangerous, grinning devil. That evening, I poured 2 glasses of cheap wine and sat opposite Julian in the living room, forcing my muscles to relax. Mark had conveniently gone to the hardware store, giving me the isolation I needed to lower Julian's guard. I feigned a soft, nostalgic sigh, looking at him over the rim of my glass. "It's crazy, isn't it?" I murmured, projecting a vulnerability I didn't feel. 20 years, and here we are. I've been thinking a lot about the old days, Julian, before everything went wrong. He swallowed the bait instantly. His posture relaxed, a triumphant, arrogant glimmer flashing in his eyes before he quickly masked it with sorrow. He launched into a sickeningly sweet monologue about our past, carefully omitting the part where he robbed me blind and vanished. He spoke about his alleged amnesia, claiming the only memory that kept him sane in the darkness was my face. My skin crawled with absolute revulsion, but I forced a sad, empathetic smile to remain plastered on my lips. "I'm just glad you're safe," I lied flawlessly. "In fact, Mark and I were talking. We want to help you get back on your feet. Maybe help you open a new bank account so your disability checks can be deposited securely." Julian's eyes completely lit up with greedy anticipation, practically vibrating with excitement at the opening. "Clara, You have no idea what that means to me, he gasped, reaching across the table to touch my hand. I suppressed a violent shudder as his fingers brushed mine. I do have some old paperwork coming in the mail to help establish my identity. He slipped up, a little too eager. I might need you to countersign a delivery, just to verify I live here now. There it was, the exact mechanism of his trap. He needed my signature to authenticate the fraudulent loan documents. I looked deep into his dark, lying eyes and nodded my head very slowly and deliberately. The next morning was a masterclass in psychological warfare. I was working at the kitchen island while Julian hovered nearby, intensely anxious about the mail delivery. His constant pacing was grating on my nerves, but I maintained the facade of the helpful, naive ex-fiancé. My phone rang. It was Carter, my lawyer, confirming that the local police fraud unit was briefed and on standby for our signal. I spoke in hushed, coded tones, confirming the timing for tomorrow afternoon. When I ended the call and turned around, my heart violently slammed into my throat. Julian was standing directly behind me, mere inches away, staring at the legal notepad where I had absent-mindedly jotted down the name of the police detective Carter had mentioned. The air in the kitchen instantly became heavy and dangerously still. "Who were you talking to?" Julian asked, his voice entirely devoid of the pitiful, helpless victim tone he had been using for 3 days. It was sharp, calculating, and cold. He glanced from my face down to the notepad. Panic surged through my veins, but I violently clamped down on it. "Just a vendor for my logistics company," I lied, forcing a sigh of exaggerated annoyance. "They messed up a shipping manifest, and the recipient is threatening to call the authorities. It's a total headache." I casually ripped the top page off the notepad, crumpled it up, and tossed it into the trash can next to the sink. I held my breath, waiting to see if he would push the issue. Julian stared at me for a long, agonizing moment, his eyes darting across my face, searching for a micro-expression of deception. The mask of the broken, amnesiac wanderer was completely gone, replaced by the cornered, desperate con artist. He finally stepped back, forcing a stiff, unnatural smile onto his face. "Work problems," he muttered quietly. He turned away from me, but I saw the sudden, sharp calculation in his stiff posture. The atmosphere in the house shifted from tense to openly hostile over the next 24 hours. Julian knew something was wrong. His predatory instincts were tingling, but his desperate need for money kept him anchored to my couch. At 2 p.m. the following day, the doorbell finally rang. It wasn't the regular mail carrier. It was a man in a crisp suit carrying a thick manila envelope, an undercover detective acting as a specialized courier. I was in the living room folding laundry when Julian practically leaped over the coffee table to get to the door first. "I'll get it," he shouted, his voice cracking with manic excitement. Mark walked out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel, positioning himself strategically between the front door and the back exit. Julian ripped open the front door. The courier looked at a clipboard. "Delivery for Clara Davis. Requires a direct signature and a secondary witness signature for a property lien authorization," the detective stated clearly, projecting his voice. Julian's hands were visibly shaking as he reached for the clipboard. "I can sign as the witness, and my fiancé, Clara, is right here to sign the primary." Julian rushed, exposing his desperate greed. He turned to me, holding the pen out like a lifeline. "Clara, this is it. This is the paperwork for my identity recovery. Just sign right here, on the bottom line." He was pointing to a document that would have legally leveraged my home for a $300,000 shadow loan. He looked at me with wild, feverish eyes, expecting the naive, broken girl from 20 years ago to blindly obey his commanding tone. I slowly put down the shirt I was folding. I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I looked at Mark, gave a tiny nod, and walked toward the door. I looked Julian dead in the eye, savoring the absolute destruction I was about to unleash. "I'm not signing anything, Julian," I said, my voice echoing coldly in the foyer. The frantic smile froze entirely on his face. "Clara, what are you doing?" "I need this," he hissed, stepping closer, attempting to use his physical presence to intimidate me. The undercover detective smoothly stepped over the threshold, closing the front door firmly behind him, trapping Julian inside the hallway. "You don't need identity recovery," I stated clearly, pulling the thick file of printed evidence from the console table drawer. "I threw the background check, The photos of his luxury Atlanta apartment, and the undeniable proof of his massive debts directly onto his chest. The papers fluttered to the floor like dead leaves. You need a bailout because you defrauded the wrong private lenders, and they are hunting you. You stole my social security number, Julian. You opened a credit card in my name. And now, you are attempting to fraudulently leverage my home to save your pathetic life. Julian's face drained of all color, transforming into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The pitiful, sick victim persona instantly vanished, replaced by an ugly, snarling rage. You stupid, ungrateful bitch, he spat, lunging toward me with clenched fists. He didn't even make it a full step. Mark moved with terrifying speed, grabbing Julian by the collar of his cheap coat and slamming him hard against the wall. The detective instantly drew his badge and handcuffs, barking commands. Julian struggled, spitting absolute venom and vicious curses, blaming me for his ruined life, screaming that I owed him this money for making him feel trapped 20 years ago. The sheer, narcissistic delusion was breathtaking. I stood perfectly still, watching the man who had haunted my nightmares for 2 decades be reduced to a violently thrashing, pathetic criminal. He was absolutely no longer a terrifying ghost, but just a desperate, completely broken, pathetic thief. The arrival of 2 marked patrol cars turned my quiet suburban driveway into a spectacle, but I didn't care about the neighbors watching. I felt lighter than I had in 20 years. They dragged Julian out of my house in handcuffs, his expensive watch now painfully visible as his sleeves rode up his arms. He stopped struggling as they pushed him toward the cruiser, turning back to look at me one last time. There was no apology in his eyes, only a cold, venomous hatred that he had finally been bested by the girl he thought was permanently broken. "You're going to regret this, Clara," he screamed, spit flying from his mouth as the officers forced him into the back seat. "You're nothing without me." I didn't yell back. I didn't need to. I just stood on my porch, leaning comfortably against my strong, steady husband, and watched the police car drive away, taking my nightmare with it. The fallout was swift and legally brutal. Because we caught him in the act of attempting a massive wire and property fraud, federal charges were added to the identity theft. The credit card company wiped the fraudulent charges from my name once the police report was filed, and Carter ensured my credit was locked down permanently. The dangerous lenders Julian had been hiding from eventually found out he was incarcerated, ensuring he would have no safe haven even if he ever got out on parole. My home remained completely untouched, my finances secure, and my peace utterly protected. Best of all, the lingering shadow of my past was permanently eradicated. Sarah came over that evening with 3 bottles of expensive champagne. We sat in the living room, exactly where Julian had tried to orchestrate my ruin, and we drank to survival. Mark held my hand, silently communicating his unwavering support. I looked around my home, feeling a profound sense of closure that therapy had never achieved. The weekend after Julian's arrest, I hired a professional cleaning service to deep scrub the downstairs sofa, the guest bathroom, and every single floorboard he had touched. I wanted absolutely no physical trace of his toxic presence left in my sanctuary. Once the smell of bleach and fresh lemon faded, the house finally felt entirely mine again. The experience forced me to confront a harsh reality about human nature. Time does not heal all wounds, and it certainly does not change a person's core character. We often romanticize the ones who got away, wondering if they have changed, if they harbor secret regrets, or if they will eventually come back to offer the closure we desperately crave. Julian proved that some people are simply emotional parasites. They do not return to apologize. They return to see if you are still a viable food source. They prey on nostalgia and weaponize your empathy against you. My advice to anyone who has survived a devastating betrayal is simple. Keep your doors locked. If a ghost from your past suddenly reappears on your porch looking for a second chance, do not offer them a seat at your table. Trust your current peace over their rehearsed tears. The life you painstakingly build after a traumatic destruction is sacred, and you owe absolute zero loyalty to the person who handed you the matches. Today, I am 45 years old. My credit is impeccable. My marriage is built on a foundation of absolute truth, and my home is a fortress of love and safety. Julian is sitting in a federal holding facility, facing a sentence that will keep him locked away until he is an old, forgotten man. I survived the destruction he caused 20 years ago, and I ruthlessly conquered the trap he set for me today. I am finally entirely free from the dark shadows, and I am absolutely never looking back.